Hello there, and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast, part of the 1517 Podcast Network. You can go to 1517.org/podcasts to see all of our shows. My name is Caleb Keith, and today I am joined by Drs. Adam Francisco and Rod Rosenblatt. Our usual other co-host, Dr. Scott Keith, is in Canada teaching an apologetics course for 2 weeks, and we'll be back shortly. This is the first episode of 2019, and before we start with our topic today, which will be a new series on the history of the Reformation, I want to thank everybody who supported us in 2018 and continues to financially partner with us in 2019. We were absolutely blown away by the amount of support at the end of the year. Between October and January 1st, we managed to raise $150,000 at 1517 from listeners and readers and supporters, and it gave us the right footing to start off this next year, which is primarily focused on reaching more people. So we're going to be expanding less. We're not going to be adding as many new podcasts or projects, but we're going to focus on improving the quality and accessibility of everything that we have going on and reaching a larger audience. So we're doing more conferences this year. We have our annual large conference in San Diego that'll be happening. Here We Still Stand 2019. We have more city events. We are planning some international events for 2020 in Germany and things like that. So this is going to be exciting. And it's really about getting the content that we've managed to develop over the last 4 or 5 years and reaching sort of that non-Lutheran, that larger audience. And we really do thank you for your support in that. So today's episode, we're going to be talking about the history of the Reformation. And if you've listened to the show for the last 3 years, you'll notice that we've talked about the Reformation quite a bit. And obviously this is 1517 is symbolic of reformational theology. But one of the things I've noticed in the last year is, as I've gone to churches, is that the sort of the story of the Reformation is either told really in brief or not told very well. And so people who are Lutherans are only sort of familiar with it, and non-Lutherans sometimes don't, and non-Christians don't understand the significance of the Reformation, even outside of sort of the religious scope, and the changes that this brought to the world. And so we're going to do a series where it's probably going to be about 15 episodes where we talk about the history of the Reformation, the precursing events and people, the background, the context, which will then also allow us to dive into the doctrines that changed and how that affected the broader world. And so we're really hoping to take this history, which is so rich, and tell it in a way that is memorable so that people leave with something valuable.
Could I suggest right at the outset some good lay-level intros to what we're going to deal with?
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
The now, I think, defunct Christian History magazine would put out issues devoted to one person or subject. There's an issue on the early Luther. There's an issue on the later Luther. There are issues on Huss. There's an issue on Wycliffe and the precursors. All of those are golden, and everything in the issue is one subject only. Then I'm going to also send to you, so people can get it for free, an article done way back in the 50s by Jaroslav Pelikan and a man named Brower. And it was used for state university students who wanted to know something about the Reformation but weren't willing to take a whole course on it. It's a magnificent little short booklet on the background of Luther, the closing of the Middle Ages, his early life, later life, and then into a quick history of what developed during the 30 Years' War and the forming of the Book of Concord. And this is something like 25 pages. It was used for students who said, give this to me, the core stuff, and give it to me quickly.
And I'll have that as a downloadable PDF off of the website that you'll be able to access from the show notes. So great. So now we're just gonna hop in, and I'm gonna kind of pass the mic over to our resident historian, Adam Francisco, and I want to know as we get into this, what's happening in the Middle Ages? Because when it's characterized sort of in Lutheranism, sometimes it's set up purely as an enemy for Luther to come and conquer, right? But as we were talking, as we were planning for the show, you were kind of saying it's a lot more complex than that, and it's kind of a shame to just categorize it in just one negative light real quickly.
Yeah, there is in the field of the academic field of history or historiography, there is a pretty long tradition, goes back to the Reformation, that some would call it a confessional approach to history, where Protestant historians of every stripe would treat the Middle Ages simply as a foil for the Reformation, and that's all well and good if you're approaching it from a theological perspective. But one thing that's interesting about the Middle Ages and the stuff that emerges or evolves in the church and so on, that Luther and company will break with, is that the Reformation the Middle Ages is a very long period.
Augustine,
1,000 years.
Yes, Augustine, and then something happened 1,000 years later.
Right.
Yeah, compared to the Reformation, which is maybe 150.
Yeah, the long view would say 150 years or so. So it's very long period. It's I don't know of a different word to use, so I'll use the D word. It's a very diverse period. It takes, we kind of assume that after Rome fell in 476 AD, very quickly, though maybe by 800 AD, Europe's Christianized and you have Christendom under Charlemagne. Actually, it takes a lot longer. So we're talking almost 500 years for Europe to be recognizably Christian after the fall of the Roman Empire. And the ones who are becoming Christian, they're all they're again, for lack of a better term, their ethnic heritage they're Germanic people. They're barbarians who worship Thor and Odin, and who are, for hundreds of years, even as they're becoming Christian, worried about cutting down trees to clear land for farms because they're afraid they're going to upset the spirits and things in the woods, while they're still
being
Christian with in a nominal sense of the term. So that stuff would be weird in the church, that the theology goes in, maybe we'll say more the popular theology, the what we could call superstition, that it would go in that direction. The more you look at the Middle Ages, the more it's not so surprising. It's not that it was inevitable, but it's sort of like the way religions go as they emerge in different regions. They mesh with that culture and they develop in their own direction. So, but when you get into, let's say, what some call the High or the Central Middle Ages, we're talking the day and age of scholasticism, the rise of universities, Thomas Aquinas, and so on. By then you've got Christendom. By then you have a pretty strong, formal, bureaucratic institutional church with a recognizable, what they would call an orthodox theology that did tolerate to some extent deviations away from it. That's one thing that's kind of surprising for like a Protestant, conservative Protestant historian. When you look at them,
it's not just one point.
Yeah, there's you don't
groups
have
like the Waldensians.
Yeah, it's all over the place. I shouldn't say all over the place, but there is some, like with the doctrine of justification, there are some, they don't get quite to the way like an Augustine or a Luther would express it. But you have some who can express a pretty strong doctrine of salvation by grace through faith on account of Christ alone.
Guys like Valdez?
Especially these lay type movements that emerge, the Peter Waldo and the Waldensian movement. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, not really, but
the Reformers liked him.
Yeah, they did because of his Christ-centered piety.
Yep.
So you can and the thing that's surprising, maybe not so surprising, is that the church was kind of comfortable with it. Was big tent Catholicism, if you will. Mm-hmm. When you get though into the later part of the Middle Ages, there isn't necessarily an institutional clamping down on these different theological expressions, but there is an increasing attempt to to deal with particular figures. You mentioned Huss, John Huss, or John Wycliffe. They dealt with him after he was dead, but exhuming his bones and so on. But you do have with the rise of what some call the papal monarchy. This notion. It's best expressed in 1302 when Boniface VIII, who, as a side note, Dante of the Inferno will put in the lowest level of hell. But in he issued a papal decree, a papal bull called the Unum Sanctum. And the last sentence or two of that official papal decree expresses what popes had always wanted for centuries, but never really had been able to do because there were strong emperors and kings always resisting them. And he concludes this bull by saying that every human being must be subject to the Holy Roman Pontiff. Yeah. Now, certainly it's understood that that's for your salvation, but it's also understood politically as well. So the church is really strong, at least theoretically, theologically, so to speak.
And I think it's also important to remember, even with all of this history up to the time you're talking about, they had not laid it down officially yet on paper. That came only under pressure later.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of that's the problem with the Middle Ages. If you want to go on a witch hunt, so to speak. I know we're not supposed to use that term anymore because you trigger witches, but if you can find extreme heretics. You can find those who aren't so heretical. I don't know if there's a middle way between heresy and orthodoxy, but there's a spectrum, as we like to say. But when you get to the high, especially in the late Middle Ages, the institutional church is strong and it's over-asserted itself. But then all of a sudden something remarkable happens in the early 14th century. The papacy moves out of the city of Rome up to Avignon, France. And then decades after that, you get, while there's a pope in France who's under the French king,
many popes.
Then you get another pope. The Italians are sick and tired of having French popes. You get a pope in Rome, and who assumes that one in Avignon is going to just sort of abdicate. He doesn't, and for up until 1414, you have this constant back and forth between Rome and Avignon. Now, so you got two popes, and you've got a papal bull issued just prior to this that for your salvation and for the right ordering of the world and so on, everybody must be subject to the Holy Roman Pontiff. Well, again,
which one? Yeah.
Which one? Especially 1300s. Good heavens. The late Middle Ages, while there's lots of developments, there's also lots of a tragedy. The bubonic plague wipes out at least a third of Europe's population. The 100 Years' War over on the western side of Europe is raging on all the way up until the middle of the 15th century. The Ottoman Turks are starting to break into southeastern Europe, so there's death everywhere. And your salvation is dependent upon your submission or your subjugation under the Holy Roman Pontiff. And you got two. Well, which one is it? And then so the church tries to deal with it in several stages. By 1414, it's decided that a council will be held at a city in Switzerland, Constance, just off the lake there. And for this council lasts 3 years. It finally, in terms of how it dealt with the papacy, by 1417, they finally elect, or they presume if they elect a new pope, the other two are going to abdicate. It doesn't happen, so you have for a time three popes. But finally, Martin V, the Pope Martin V will finally resolve all of that, and so that the papacy, if you will, is restored. But in that council, there's also that's where Jan Hus, 2 years before the end of that council, is burned to the stake for heresy. And so Jan Hus is just one of many figures in the late Middle Ages who are consciously trying to bring reform within the church. Sometimes it was more institutional. And not just
moral reform.
Correct, right. Sometimes it's moral, theological, and institutional. Sometimes it's more institutional. Sometimes it's more it just depends on which person you're looking at. But a guy like Jan Hus is focused a lot more than others on the theological side.
Yep.
Jan Hus could even say things that they don't sound... I don't want to say they sound Lutheran, but he could call the papacy the Antichrist. He could, well, Wycliffe was a little stronger on this, but insist on the laity having access to the scriptures in the vernacular language, calling. I mean, I guess in short, you could say there were these reformers like Jan Hus and Wycliffe would be the two big ones, who when they saw things being practiced in the church, or they heard somebody assert some sort of theological statement, they would sort of squint their eyes a bit, because they recognized that what was being practiced or taught didn't square well with the text of Scripture. So do they have a doctrine of sola scriptura like you see in the Reformation? Not really, but it's not too far off. So some people, Alistair McGrath most popularly, will refer to people like Huss and Wycliffe and Peter Waldo, the Waldensians, and others as forerunners of the Reformation. Heiko Obermann has a book with that exact title. So you have a lot of that.
Everything he did was about the continuity through the High Middle Ages to the Reformation, and it's continuity, not war. Yeah,
that. When you first introduced the episode, I wanted to mention something about that. About I think you referred to, like, sometimes we approach the Middle Ages like it's something
for Luther to conquer
or something.
Yeah,
and there has been a pretty significant turn. Heiko Obermann was in many ways at the forefront of this, where since the late 19th through most of the 20th century, one of the big question for historians, and probably most people don't care about this question, but historians do, was the Reformation a medieval movement or a medieval thing, or is it the beginning of early modernity or something?
Yeah.
And it was assumed by a lot that Luther, for example, is this great apostle of liberty and so on. Well, yes, but also no. Luther is very much a late medieval man.
Yes.
And Heiko Obermann's the guy who really kind of seals that case and forced historians to kind of refigure or rethink where they, how they interpret the significance of the Reformation in terms of like historical chronology. So it's a late medieval thing. It wasn't predictable, but that Luther was the things he does early on in his life with the nailing of the 95 Theses, the debates he has during his ecclesiastical trials. That stuff is very normal for the late Middle Ages, and there's different ways. If you spend any time in Luther research or reading Luther books, you'll see that there's a lot of debate over when things happen.
Sure.
But I think it's fair to say from 1517, when he nails, probably a year prior, leading up to his nailing of the 95 Theses, up until 1521, that's where you start to see Luther becoming increasingly, if you will, evangelical. And it's all hashed out. He's in terms of his doctrine of authority, where he will finally come to the position of sola scriptura. 1519, 1520, somewhere thereabouts. And he acknowledges in one of his writings, I don't remember the exact which one it was exactly, that it was when he prepared for his debate, I think it was with John Eck, that debate, that he knew he had to do all his homework, because John Eck was no mean theologian. And in doing all of his research, he had to do historical research to back up his claims that the church has, his earlier claims that the church has always has contradicted itself. Teachings of the papacy, there are different popes who contradict themselves, and
the foundation in the Pseudo-Isidorian decretals that the papacy was very, very early, and he discovered it was a counterfeit.
Right, and same with the donation of Constantine.
Yes.
He learned from some of the humanists that this is just a forgery. So it's in those debates where he actually has to do his homework, because he's got to know his stuff, right? That he's working out his eventually what will become, we might call, his Reformation theology.
And most all people will say, during the explosion of his three major works in 1523, he's got it cold cocked by then.
Yeah, I would say 1521, well, let's just say early 1520s.
Sure.
Yeah, like after the era of disputations, which we'll get into in later episodes as well.
Can I just add one thing about these disputations? That's the interesting thing. Through the Middle Ages, with the scholastic movement and all the academic disputes, the one thing that's really, especially from our day and age, that's often misunderstood is that one thing great about these disputations is that medieval people, scholastic people, really believed that there was truth, and it was worth debating. And that you could actually, if you have enough evidence, the evidence would determine what is the case. I think of Thomas Aquinas, who Lutherans aren't supposed to like. I have as we've talked about in earlier episodes, a little fondness for some of his political and legal writings, especially his anti-Islamic writings. But he, in his dialectic, this scholastic dialectical method, they typically would ask a question, of theological or some other import, and then they would go through the different ways you could answer that question and see which answers had the most evidence and the better rationale behind it. And whatever one was stronger in terms of evidence from their perspective on the world in the 13th century or whatever century, they would go with that. And that's Luther very much is you used to say in class, Dr. Rosenblatt, that the Protestant Reformation was very much a movement born in the university. And Luther is very much a schoolman, a kind of a scholastic, and had it not been that sort of late medieval context, he would. Well, it's hard to say, it would be speculative, but the conclusions he drew were a result of his scholastic thinking.
Very well read.
Lombard sentences was the standard curriculum, and then when Luther was assigned to be a Bible prophet at Wittenberg, he did what he was told and started to, for the first time, really get serious with the text for his lectures, and the corner started to turn.
Yeah, that was probably the biggest mistake the church made.
Yes,
is when
go get your doctorate in Bible.
I recall reading something on how Staupitz, his father, confessor there in Erfurt at the Augustinian monastery, again another medieval thing, thought that Luther was going to end up hurting himself, not necessarily taking his own life, but he was just so serious in terms of his monastic discipline. He was constantly getting sick. He was losing a lot of weight. So Luther needed a distraction, and so he said, "Oh, let's just send him up to Wittenberg. There's a new university up there, and he can do a degree in the Bible." Big mistake. Especially with a temperament like Luther. I mean, his name. Luther comes from it was Luder, right? And he changes his name as he has his Reformation breakthrough to Martin Eleutherius, which is Greek for truth. He really wanted to know what was true, and he wanted to make sure there was evidence. And for him, especially, as he learns very quickly, it's assumed in the late Middle Ages that there's this what Obermann used to call a co-inherence between the authority, the written text, and the unwritten authority of the traditions of the papacy. And Luther learns very quickly you can't hold that ladder because they're just so contradictory. There's no biblical support for it. The historical support for it has all been made up, and he breaks free from that as a sort of a logical necessity, if you will.
Yes, I mean, one of the big takeaways I think people really need to have here is that it's not simply religious implications also. There are a lot of political implications on the line. When the reformers or people challenged the church, they were challenging an empire, essentially, right? Which there's fear of disrupting people, like you said, war, death. Can things get worse? And then for the common person, too, who might not be affected as much, assurance of salvation if the church is undermined. Because as you said, with the papacy, that's where their assurance lies. And so if somebody challenges that, you could have sort of mob takeover when everybody thinks there's no rule anymore or I'm not saved and things like that, right?
Another thing that most people, I think, know, the Protestant Reformation is not radical. Luther's overarching principle was if what we've inherited doesn't contradict the gospel, we do well to keep it. In other words, his was continuity. Compare the Campbellite movement or other sects where the church, for the first time in 2,000 years, has been clarified by our leader. It's characteristic of the sects. And it isn't characteristic of Luther. He would argue, well, they still read the scriptures every morning, and they still baptized, and they still, in their own way, celebrated the Lord's Supper. He was looking for continuity, not some radical new thing for the first time in 2,000 years.
Which is why there's and again, we'll do this in detail later, but why there's a contrast between the Lutheran reformers and the radical reformers, right, who are trying to throw all tradition sort of out the window.
Yeah, that's a better illustration than the Campbellites.
Well, and to recommend some bibliography on this, at least the titles are real illustrative of what we've just been talking about. Charles Porterfield Krauth has this book, The Conservative Reformation and Its Theology, and it focuses just on those reformers who know it's dangerous for a variety of reasons to break from tradition, but at the same time knew that there are some things that just because they're tradition, if they don't square up with Scripture, they got to go. And it's great treatment, though it's older. It's dated. It's
but
great
he's
treatment.
Great,
incredible historical theologian. And then there's this George Hunston Williams, The Radical Reformation. It's a long book, I think about 700 pages, but it goes
best introduction. Williams is the first Anabaptist introduction to the whole thing, especially understandable to those who aren't in it already.
And any other books or?
That's probably enough.
This is not a histography, but I wrote a short blog. It's about 1,200 words on the 1517 site to describing and characterizing enthusiasm and what it looks like in the Reformation, and sort of what it would look like as a reemergence now. So I'll link to that blog as well.
People might not know what you mean by enthusiasm.
Radical, sort of the results of the Radical Reformation. So I'll link to that. So as we have about 10 minutes left. So the next part I want to do with this episode, and we've talked about Luther a little bit, but I want to talk about the pre-Reformation Luther a little bit. What was his life shaping up to look like, or what was it before he becomes a monk? Why become a monk? And sort of broader as well, why Germany, why the German states? Germany didn't exist as it does now as sort of, a unified country.
One to be a unified country.
Which is another kind of great historical point into the 20th century.
There's a very simple answer to the question you asked. He became a monk in hopes of saving his soul.
Because of all these assurance issues going on.
And there's this great story from Luther when he's returning back to university from visiting his parents, and I think it was like 1505 or thereabouts, where he's caught in the middle of a thunderstorm, and he does what a smart person does in a thunderstorm, climbs under the tallest tree.
And cries out to Saint Anne,
I'll become a monk, and
vowed it.
And he gets back to Erfurt, and one of the first things he does is goes to the monastery and enters the monastery or the cloister as a novitiate, where basically a year-long probationary period to see.
And a rigorous one, an Augustinian one. That means rigor.
Very disciplined. Ora et labora, the old slogan of Western monasticism. Prayer and work is your life is ordered around that. There is no leisure.
Canonical hours.
Basically every 3 hours, with the exception of a period at nighttime. You have to say, recite your prayers, pray the Psalms, or different hours have different sort of liturgies for it. We know from, this is fairly famous stuff with Luther's life, that he was personally, he didn't need somebody to tell him how to live a disciplined life. He did it himself. He would spend weeks on end not sleeping in his, probably wasn't all that comfortable, but his cot, he'd spend it sleeping on the floor in the middle of a German winter. Constantly getting sick.
Undernourished. He said, my problem wasn't that I was a bad monk. My problem was that I was a good one. The
best darn monk, I think he says at one point, that Rome had. He'd whip himself with a little flagellum, like a short little whip with the bones and other things at the end to as an act of penance.
Yeah.
Confess almost continuously throughout the day. Wear out confessors, because the aphorism was, you'll be forgive for any and all sins that you confess.
Mm-hmm.
And he took that literally and said, unconfessed sin can damn me. So as soon as he thought of something he'd forgotten to confess, he'd be back in the confessional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Staupitz saw this, and it worried him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So he struggles with assurance. He struggles with his own sin very deeply. There's obviously somebody who confesses that often. There's obviously a very high level of guilt there over these things. He goes to the monastery, whether that story is completely true or not, out of sort of a duty and obligation that to a promise that he makes, right? Mm-hmm. Whether that's not even for the betterment of his life necessarily, right? Against the wishes of his parents and
father especially.
Yeah. And despite all that, he does not find hope there, does he?
Yeah, it does just the opposite.
He even makes a trip down to Rome, a pilgrimage down to Rome, barefoot, on walking. It's over 1,000 miles through the Alps. And when he's there, he starts to get a little glimmer or a little window into the corruption of the papacy.
Yeah, he was shocked.
Yeah.
What
So,
he saw.
like the stuff that's going on internally with him, and maybe the stuff he's seeing externally.
He's not getting hope out of this promise of where he might have been able to find assurance and hope. And on top of it, he's seeing sort of the papacy in its full political glamour, right? Taxing people, running tourist operations with, what do you call, with, I don't want to say idols, but what do you call it?
Relics.
Relics, thank you.
Yes.
Relics and things like that. It's literally like tourist shops and massive taxation. So not only is he personally troubled, then he's sort of seeing a place that's supposed to give him hope, doubling down on the trouble.
Yep.
And then, going back a bit to the papacy, just to thumb our noses a bit more at it, there were stories circulating, some of them true, of just how corrupt popes were.
Yeah.
One pope there's like a little slogan that went around that he had turned the Vatican into a brothel. Yeah. You have the Renaissance popes in particular were corrupt. They bought
Innocent III.
Innocent III, he's the power-hungry guy, and
what a name!
But there's a bunch of them. I think John the 23rd was John.
Earlier in 23rd, he's 20th century.
I'm thinking 13th then.
A lot of popes with the same name. Just a different number behind them.
Yeah.
But he did. There's no doubt that he saw that. It was just devastating to him.
Yeah, there's a Pope Nicholas who was very corrupt. The Renaissance popes, there's about 5 of these guys. So Leo X would be one of them. Julius. They preferred hunting. Some of them preferred hunting over administrating the papacy, and that's not so bad. But there are rumors of even things like pederasty, and I don't know how true those were, but I can imagine.
Yeah, it's not.
Well, we've got to remember, Luther grew up not like Calvin. Luther grew up a superstitious peasant.
Mm-hmm.
And he's only latecomer to talking to nobility and state officials. One time in his life, he said, if you want this in the language that you're used to, ask Philip. I'm a peasant. And that was true. Yeah. He grew up in superstition and never really shed some of it. It was drilled into him with the formative years.
So, Rod, do you think there's a sort of a fair comparison here between sort of the brokenness that Luther is experiencing with this guilt with the church at this point, and sort of what you've expressed as those broken by the modern church? There's obviously less of this political drama going on for people in the modern church, but there's still a lack of assurance is ultimately what's going to cause this.
It's Dr. Mansky again, when he taught his intro course for years at Christ College Irvine, and he set it up Rome law, Lutheran law gospel, and everybody else law gospel law. And that's what breaks the back of the evangelical, because he's not given any sacraments, and so the only thing he's got to turn to is back to remembering his own conversion to Jesus and whether it was genuine or not. But there's nothing in his church that delivers the forgiveness of sins. They'd call that an ordinance at best, and certainly not a sacrament. If you ask on the question of assurance, even a badly catechized Lutheran is going to go to, I was baptized in the name of the Trinity, and just last Sunday, the pastor put the very body of Christ and the very blood of Christ into my mouth and told me this was for you and for your sin. The evangelical has nothing like it, and it has a way of breaking them, and I would, me too.
Yeah, the question is, what is the final word that defines who you are and your status before God and ultimately all else?
Yeah, even when we argue for sola fide, which I was doing in that paper, even if we argue for sola fide, still it's another way of saying only Christ in his death.
Yeah, that faith is founded on the faithfulness of Christ to the cross.
Yeah, it isn't, again, it isn't my inner saving faith. It's the object of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we're alone in that. I asked Dr. Horton one time when the microphones were off, do you believe that you know that you're of the elect by the gracious God giving you just a little glimpse into your growth? And Mike answered, heavens no, that's Puritanism. I said, fair enough. How do you know? And he said, by my faith in Christ. And I thanked him.
Yeah, but the end point still, it's my, right?
Yep.
Not sort of the external action of God, which is what, when we express it, what we're hoping the answer comes out as, right?
Yep.
So this is a good point to sort of lead into next episode. What we're going to do this time, we've now sort of ended with Luther in the monastery, and we're going to talk about what happens next, sort of this transition from monastery to university, what Luther's studying, what Luther's teaching, and why those things are going to sort of inform him of this hope that really is in the scriptures that he's not getting out of the church in his time. Thanks, Adam, for the great history of sort of the medieval world summed up in 30 minutes. It's pretty great. And we're going to look forward to talking more about this next time. Thank you for joining us on this episode. Bye-bye.